Welcome, everyone, to our interview with Dr. David Lisak as part of our End Rape campaign here at the Representation Project. As you may know, the Representation Project uses films and activism to advance gender justice, and we're especially known for our impact filmmaking. We have focused quite a bit on the causes and consequences of sexual violence in our series, expert interview series, and I really am honored to have Dr. Lisak here today. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that the topic today is sexual violence, and so it could be triggering, it could activate you. It might be best if this is triggering or activating to watch this. It will be recorded and available for public consumption. So maybe watch it later so you can skip over parts or do it at your own pace. But with no further ado, let's jump in here. Dr. David Lisak is a clinical psychologist who has devoted his professional life to studying the causes and consequences of interpersonal violence. His research on non-stranger rapists and on the long-term impact of childhood sexual abuse in adult men has been published in the leading scientific journals in his field. And for the past 25 years, Dr. Lisak has served as a forensic consultant, a professional trainer, and a public speaker across the United States. He has served on the faculty of the National Judicial Education Project and the American Prosecutors Research Institute. He has also served as a consultant to judicial, prosecutor, and law enforcement education programs across the country. David has conducted trainings and workshops in all 50 states in the United States. This is a man who you probably know his name if you have done any work anywhere around or adjacent to sexual violence. He has conducted trainings and workshops in all 50 states and consults with universities and the 4 services of the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, and other institutions regarding sexual assault prevention and policies. David consults frequently on sexual violence and homicide cases across the country, and he serves as an expert witness in death penalty cases where issues of child abuse are pertinent, and in sexual assault cases on issues of victim behavior and offender characteristics. He is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and he is a founding board member of 1 in 6, which is a national nonprofit organization devoted to helping men who are sexually abused as children. Welcome, David. It is so good to have you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's jump right in. I am really happy that we're tackling the issue of sexual abuse with a focus on men. I think oftentimes because this is a crime that disproportionately affects women and gender non-conforming folks, we tend to gloss over the fact that men are survivors of sexual abuse. And I really am just happy that we're focusing on that topic now and spending an entire conversation on it. But let's start with you. David, tell us about your research and advocacy work on sexual violence. Obviously, I just read your bio, but you have worked tirelessly to advance our knowledge about serial perpetration, the roots of sexual violence, what happens later in life to survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Tell us about the major projects and organizations you've worked with and what inspired you to research these topics.
Well, I'll start with that last part. What inspired me is, as you just mentioned, I myself experienced sexual abuse as a child. I also come from a family of Holocaust survivors, so it was probably destiny that I was going to be working in the field of trauma in one way or another. I started working on sexual violence because when I was in graduate school, it's really the beginning of the sort of the modern era of trauma studies, and the returning veterans from Vietnam were one impetus for this sort of new focus on trauma. But the other impetus was sexual violence. It was just becoming more and more apparent that there used to be it's widely quoted, and it's real, that they used to say that incest was it happens, but it's like a 1 in a million circumstance. And out of the 1960s, the consciousness raising efforts of the women's movement became very apparent that that was ridiculous and that it was far more common. And that started the sort of an opening, societal opening. And so in the early 80s, it was hitting graduate schools, and research was starting to really accelerate. So I was caught up in that, and of course I had my own history that made that a kind of a good match. And then I started focusing on perpetrators, and I think I was just trying to figure out, why do people do this? Why is it so common? And so I started studying rapists, but not incarcerated rapists, not men who commit what we think of as stranger rape, but one of the other things that we were learning is that the vast majority of rapes are not stranger circumstances; they are non-stranger. And at that point, there was essentially no research on who these guys are. It was, anybody who wanted to study rapists went to a prison. So that sort of started that aspect of my research. It's complicated to locate, identify those men and interview them, but it's not, back then anyway, it wasn't that difficult. So I started that, and then within a few years, I also started work on studying men who were abused as kids, sexually abused as kids, as you said, because there's even back then, there was research on children who suffer sexual abuse, and in much of that research, the subjects were both male and female children, oftentimes roughly equal numbers. Where the boys disappeared is when you looked at the research coming out on adults who had suffered child sexual abuse, and in that research there were virtually no men. There were all studies of women, and and I think what that was all about was basic gender stuff. It's boys are children just like girls. They're vulnerable. I knew already enough about sexual predators that they go after vulnerability. So they're constantly targeting vulnerability, and vulnerability can be, it can be who's the most intoxicated in a room. It can be, any number of things. But of course, age is another one. If you're a sexual predator and you are trying to manipulate a potential victim, the younger that potential victim is, the more likely it is that you'll be able to manipulate them. And so sexual predators actually, this is, again, still probably not all that well acknowledged. Many sexual predators do not target a specific age group or gender or sex. They go after vulnerable people. And so men who have committed a number of rapes of adults may very well start targeting kids because they discover that actually kids are easier. So I started doing research on men who had experienced sexual abuse, and sort of followed that track for, sort of simultaneously with my research on rapists. So that's sort of the history of it. And the other aspect of sort of the work I've done is, I was a faculty member at University of Massachusetts in Boston for many years, but I always felt a lot of tension between my work as a researcher and applied work. I, very early started working with law enforcement, with prosecutors, judges. There was so much need to, and still is, to improve the way the justice system handles these cases. And I've come to realize as I age, that, this is going to be a multi-generational effort. You can see some improvements here and there, but there's still an enormous amount of work, and there are enormous problems in how the criminal justice system handles these cases. So that's just an effort that's going to require an army of experts, advocates, everything, to continue the pressure to make these changes.
So talk to us more about that, David. What are the changes that need to be made? What, triage, and then long term, how do we fix the system?
Yeah. Well, there are sort of tactics and strategies, I guess. Of course, more training, is required, from all the way up from law enforcement, men and women who are walking the beat, to the investigators who are, charged with gathering the evidence to prosecute a case, to the prosecutors themselves. So there's an enormous amount of training, and that training is endless, because you train one cohort and they move on, and all of a sudden you have to train the next. It's a permanent process. But underneath that, there's something even more fundamental, that many of the deep problems in the criminal justice system are not so much a lack of training as the men and women who you need to train have grown up in a culture that produces such deep-seated biases and attitudes, that, and those things are really hard to undo. And training is not a great method to try to undo those kinds of things. And that's what victims encounter all the time. It's I think anybody who's here, listening to this, is very aware that if you're somebody who has just suffered a sexual assault, doesn't matter, male, female, whatever, all right, and you encounter somebody who's, in their facial expression, in their tone, in just a million ways. And of course, when you're traumatized, you are hypersensitive to all of these cues. And you're getting the message that they don't believe you and they don't care. And, and that'll shut down a case right there. That's why, the work that we're talking about, yes, we have to sort of work specifically in the field, training law enforcement, training prosecutors, and so forth. But there's an awful lot of work that has to be done at a much deeper, much more fundamental level, and how children are taught about gender, how I think we can all imagine what this is. We're talking about deep cultural change, and that's why I think we have to measure this in generations.
Can I do another follow-up, which would be, what are some of these commonly held beliefs that someone's going to encounter in the system, that rape myths that you would love to get rid of? And you're saying it's really entrenched in the way it's not just a matter of training when you're adults and professionals. It would start with a cultural paradigm shift, education, parenting, children. But what are some of these myths that that survivors encounter in the system?
Well, they're, I think, very familiar to most people. one of the most pernicious is that the victim somehow could have prevented it, or the victim did something dumb or stupid, or to get themselves into a situation which then led to the assault. So all the ways of blaming victims, and it's a basic defense mechanism that whether it's a police officer, detective, prosecutor, or just a family member or a friend who learns about the assault, and it's nobody wants to think that this can happen to any of us, and so the most common defense is, well, let's blame it on the victim, and if I can point the finger at them, they did something stupid that led to this, then I don't have to feel like it could happen to me. It's as simple as that. And part of the in the work I do on death penalty cases, I got really tired, in fact, angry at this collusion that I began to see over and over again in these cases. I'd be in, federal court testifying in a hearing or something, and there'd be other experts, and they would say, well, yeah, this guy was sexually abused when he was a kid, and they say that as though that really tells all you need to know. They were sexually abused, and really, what that is it's not a very subtle one. It's a collusion where everybody in that courtroom, so you've got a federal judge, you've got all these attorneys, and you've got the defendant sitting there. So this is the guy who committed a crime, right? But it's also the guy who was just brutalized as a child. And that brutalization is just labeled sexual abuse, as though now everybody in the courtroom understands what that is. And actually, nobody in that courtroom understands what that is. So, and this is another sort of part of the problem is, whether it's the law enforcement, prosecutors, anybody dealing with this, it protects themselves from the reality of what this really means, whether it's a woman who's come in who's been raped, whether it's a child who was raped. Nobody really wants to face what really happens to somebody who suffers that kind of assault. And so I've been in federal courtrooms where I, instead of saying, yes, he was sexually abused, I go into minute by minute details of what this child suffered. And it's a very interesting experience because, nobody will interrupt you when you start doing that. And it just silences the courtroom. But what it's very clear is that it's the first time that anybody in this courtroom has been forced to understand what lies behind that term, sexual abuse. And so that's part of also the work that has to be done is we know we have the research that shows the long-term impact of all the different forms of child abuse and neglect. But we don't really want to face why it has such a long-term impact, because it is that devastating. There's a lot of work to do yet.
Shifting gears slightly, but this fits with what you're saying, right? About, and a theme that keeps coming up that I'm hearing come up is people not wanting to acknowledge the depths of the horror, right? And the trauma from childhood abuse. We don't actually want to think it can happen to us. We don't actually want to know the details of things that are happening at such a rate that we can call it an epidemic. But The title of this talk is Biology, Ideology, and Sexual Violence. And I know one of the kind of challenges or barriers to truly addressing this problem is not really properly identifying the problem. You have long been an advocate of using both natural and social science findings on sexual violence rather than just ideology. Can you tell us some of the ways that academics and advocates are following ideology instead of science? So for example, the idea that male survivors are more resilient because they have privilege, folks who challenge the link between childhood sexual abuse and perpetration of abuse later on, the idea that gender is entirely socially constructed. So this is the controversial part of the interview, David.
Okay, well, I'll try to be brief and talk about two instances. And the first one, I'll deal with sort of my own home field kind of thing. In the field of male survivors. All right, so there's now a group of us around the world working on providing services for men and doing research on male survivors of sexual abuse and physical abuse. And there is a problem, okay, and the problem that many of these men want to address is the myth that if you're a man and you were sexually abused as a child, you are destined to become a perpetrator. Right? And in fact, sexual abuse leads to sexual perpetration. It's, very kind of concrete. And it's not true. It's not true that it inevitably leads it to perpetration. But there is a link. It's like everything else in life, it's a complicated link. And if you look closely at the research, probably the only thing you can say with real certainty is that any form of serious child abuse, physical or sexual or both, it increases the likelihood of some kind of perpetration later in life. And it's not a small increase, it's quite measurable. However, even with that increase, the vast majority of men who were abused as kids never go on to perpetrate anything. And those are not contradictory statements. It's just but it's just really hard for people to kind of live with complexity. Everybody wants it to be simple, and the temptation, when you're an advocate, so there are men who are themselves abused as kids, and they grow up and they want to advocate for fellow survivors, and so they want to just say, no, that's, the fact that there's, or the myth, they call it a myth, that there's a connection between child abuse and perpetration. It's just false. And it isn't false. It's not a destiny, it's not destiny. So that's one example. Another example that I encountered in my career is, I did a lot of research on serial offending among rapists, and there's a lot of data and all kinds of data that this is a huge part of the problem, that serial offenders, it's straightforward math. If you're committing repeatedly these assaults, then serial offenders as a group are going to be responsible for a wildly disproportionate percentage of the assaults that are taking place. And serial offenders, again, it's fairly obvious, they're kind of different than somebody who just does it once. Now, I ran into, a lot of resistance and opposition and all kinds of things from people who were interested in increasing the use and the acceptance of restorative justice techniques for resolving or handling criminal and civil cases involving sexual violence. And I think restorative justice is a fabulous idea. But I also think that there's a complication that has to be dealt with, and that is, can you use restorative justice in a context or in a where the offender might be a serial offender, and or at least you would want to make sure that this isn't a serial offender before you engage in a restorative justice process with that individual. I really didn't have much success in sort of bringing that idea forward and having it be, sort of, and that's just another example that, people come up with good ideas like restorative justice, and if it becomes an ideological sort of battle where this is, what we're trying to foster, then, inconvenient truths basically get in the way. And it's just, part of how human beings are. We all, we're all subject to it. But I do think that that's it was always a frustration for me, that, we are dealing with really complicated problems, and data, good research and good data are really valuable. So when ideology gets in the way, it always frustrates me.
Yes, indeed. Right. Because addressing the problem requires that we properly identify it with all of its complexity. And what was your data? College campuses, it's 4% perpetrating 91% of the violence, and then Rideout found it was 11% or so.
Yeah.
About 95%.
The numbers are pretty stark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a serial perpetration problem. Okay. Talk to us about male survivorship. So we know that when male survivors come forward, they face an extra layer of stigma and shaming. Tell us the things that you wish everyone knew about male survivorship and how we might be able to reduce that shaming.
So, the heart of this is gender socialization, how gender is sort of seen and conceived of, and how it's taught to everybody, to our kids. And I think everybody's familiar with the basics of this. When you grow up male, you get very intense messages from pretty much virtually everywhere. You turn on your television, you stream a movie now, whatever it is, the message that if you grow up biologically male, sort of this is the path. And that path is, of course, I'll just keep it simple. It's the opposite of vulnerability. You just, you can't be vulnerable if you're going to go down that path of masculinity. Now, so what happens then if you're growing up and you early on you perceive that's the path, that's the only path really, is masculinity, and the invulnerability of it, the denial of fear of anything that would suggest that you're vulnerable, and in that context, then you suffer something like sexual, somebody rapes you, and you are helpless and powerless and completely vulnerable. Well, so how do you go on? What you do, and what almost every single male that I have encountered, and I have encountered thousands, goes through a lengthy period of time where you just deny it. And for many men, that means literally just suppressing it so that they don't even remember it anymore. And at a minimum, you swear yourselves to absolute secrecy. Nobody can find out that this happened to you, because what it means to who you are. So you silence yourself. And of course, what that does to that boy is isolates him entirely. And of course, you can imagine a sexually abused boy probably has a few misconceptions about what happened, about who was at fault, about what led to this, about what this child, what it means about who this child is, and so forth. But they have nobody, no older person, adult, anybody who can talk to them about this. And so they, of course, come up with the worst possible interpretations of what happened and what it means to them. And those ideas and everything that all those consequences just fester. So that's the real, the harm of the stigma, is it prevents boys from finding any kind of help, any kind of connection with anybody else who can mitigate the impact of what happened to them. And that's why fighting the stigma is so important. So, I started this project called the Bristlecone Project, really just asking men who had experienced sexual abuse to agree to be interviewed. And then I take their portraits and we actually videotape the interviews. But they have to be willing to go up on this website with their full name, their portraits, and their stories. And it's all an effort to show other men that, the stigma doesn't have to be, the silencing that it has been for so many generations. So that's one of the things that obviously there's, any human being who suffers this feels all kinds of stigma. It's just in certain ways it is experienced as more intense by men because it so violates their gender socialization and that's so that's and there are many downstream consequences of that isolation. If you can never receive any kind of counter information to your misconceptions and so forth, and then you never find any connection, any help, it's a much rougher road.
Mm-hmm. We're going to jump into questions soon. I have one last question for you to pull it all together, and it pulls on that thread. And you talked a bit about perpetration and some of the factors involved there, and then the broken system, and that this is going to take many generations, and then the complications with even identifying the complexity of the problem because ideology is getting in the way. If you had a magic wand, what do we need to do as a society to stop the intergenerational transmission of sexual violence?
Well, obviously, there's no one thing. I do think that one of the things that I think is maybe easiest is not the right word, but relatively speaking, it is one of the easiest things that we can do is talk openly about it. There's tremendous power in more and more, and I've seen this over the years now. More and more men have come forward. When I started the Bristlecone Project, I thought maybe I'd find 6 or 7 guys who'd be willing to participate. Got 140 now on the website, and if I could meet with all the men who have volunteered. I've got 155 or up to 200 men who volunteered, who are waiting, to be interviewed. And I'm also seeing more and more young men willing to participate, men in their 20s and 30s. And I just think in every possible way, for example, the woman who came forward and pursued the civil case against Donald Trump, when people like her show that kind of courage and persistence, it sends a message to other survivors, and it just changes the ground that we are standing on. And that's what has to continue to happen. It's and beyond that, how we stop intergenerational trauma is, we have to address it early. So, and this gets back to, with kids who are subject to this kind of brutalization, you've got a fairly short window to intervene effectively. And so we have to have much more intensive interventions that are available, and our social services, the social services that we have in place to provide those kinds of interventions are way short of what they need to be. If the Pentagon's budget was applied to our social services, we'd see some dramatic changes, and we'd see the downstream consequences of that. But we don't get the budget that the Pentagon gets.
Indeed. And we would see it immediately, right? We would see parents getting support services, intervention, institutions being held more accountable. And that ties into Christine's question, our first question. Mm-hmm. How can we decrease the collusion we see by society, for example, the Catholic Church and maybe some other institutions, academic, law enforcement, in not protecting the sacredness of childhood and in not keeping children safe?
Well, you've got to hold those institutions accountable. And, let's be a little bit positive, because this could be a pretty grim conversation. Over the last, 20, 30 years, the Catholic Church has been held accountable in a number of ways. And yes, it falls short in many ways. And despite all this accountability, the Catholic Church is still not sort of behaving in a way that I or many people would want. The Boy Scouts, that went on for generations, and now the Boy Scouts have been held accountable, and yes, it's never enough, but it is something. And there are organizations, the Zero Abuse Project, one of them that is out there training institutions, how to have policies and procedures in place that are more likely to protect children. And the other side of it, when we have an ongoing open dialogue about this, and we do not try to suppress it, and we talk openly about it, kids hear that. And so one thing to remember is, we are never going to be able to stop all sexual abuse. But if we can create an environment in which more kids feel like if something does happen to them, they can disclose it, and disclose it not 30 years later, but disclose it within months. That's an enormous difference. I think many of us here are probably parents, and I mean, you know that if something like that happened to one of your children, you know, my mother found out that I was sexually abused when I was 36 years old.
Mm.
And what a difference it would have made if I'd been able to tell her when I was 6 years old. So, and that, you know, that's something we can do, is we can do it within our own families, of course, but we can do it also at a societal level, is just be talking openly about this. And those of us who have suffered sexual abuse, as much as possible, we need to talk openly about it, and not to, you know, feel like, well, I don't want to mention it because there's, you know, we need to talk about it.
And where should we be having these conversations? And I can already hear the pushback, right, from some parents saying, I don't want my child to know about sexual violence. But so when should we be having these conversations with him, and where should they be happening?
Well, with kids, obviously, that's, you know, parents know, you know, their own children, and they obviously have to be the ones who determine what, you know, when is the right time and how. But they need to hear that, you know, you don't protect your child necessarily by avoiding the conversations about it. And most of us as parents, you know, our kids know a lot more than we think they know. And they may be wondering about things, and they may have misconceptions about things. And so, you know, there's always a way to have a conversation with a child. And if you open the conversation, then you can find out where your child is. You know, are they wondering about it? Are they frightened about it? Is there somebody at school who's making them uncomfortable? So, you know, there are programs, there are, you know, nonprofits and so forth that have done a lot of work on how to do this, and you can go on their websites and you can get training, and you can, so you don't, and as a parent, you don't have to be alone with this. There are, you know, people who can help guide you to have these conversations in a safe and appropriate way. But it's also just adults being willing to talk about their own experiences, so that it's not just some secret, you know, some mysterious bad thing that nobody should talk about.
Right. Yes. So we talk about it so that we understand the scope of the, you know, that it is everywhere, and we talk about it to destigmatize it. And I'm assuming, you know, social media, we should see more of this in our media, and not just on specific shows dedicated toward that institution. Should be having these conversations, political leaders, influencers. Switching gears slightly, Sean, this isn't a question, but maybe you want to speak to this. Sean says, gender norms are devastating. I am a male sane, I say sane nurse. When trying to pursue this education, there was a lot of stigma from the hospital leadership because of my gender. Fighting the stigma is key. Yes,
yes. And you know what, Sean, that battle, you know, understand that that's part of the battle. And by taking that road, you are changing the landscape. And so, you know, I guess what I'm saying is, you know, you are and have and probably will suffer. But it's not suffering for nothing. That's how things change. So I salute you.
Yes, indeed. The courage for folks to come forward, enter fields that they're not accepted in, talk about things that are stigmatized, all the courageous efforts of the campus anti-rape movement, the Me Too movement, all of, you know, what the campus anti-rape movement in the early 90s, the first organized efforts against sexual violence when Black women organized during Reconstruction, including Ida B. Wells, and just tracing it all the way back. We have these courageous folks who are pushing, and that's why we're talking about this right now, today. An anonymous attendee asks, from the little work I've done with college-age survivors, I remember that a big barrier to justice was students not understanding the definitions of sexual assault and rape, and thus not knowing they can report the incident as a crime. But the question isn't about survivors or victims so much as those who offend. So the question is, do you find that young men who offend are aware that they're committing a rape? Is there data that shows young men know what they're doing? And maybe, David, if you could break down the typology of, I mean, you talked about serial rapists versus one-off rapists. If you could talk more about what we know about perpetrators.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, there are some men who, aren't aware that, the behaviors that they are engaging in are actually, sort of what they are accounted for in the criminal code. But in the interviews that I've done, these guys know that they are, at a minimum, that they are using their power to force something on another human being that other human being is not consenting to. And there's a million ways in which you can, as a human being, you can protect yourself from really acknowledging that. But it's convenient. I mean, they are embedded in in their own social network, in their own long history of misogyny and just a sort of a culture of negating the humanity of other people who happen to be a different sex or a different gender, and it's just convenient not to have to confront that. So, yeah, you could at some level say some of these men are not, sort of purely consciously aware that what they're doing, is a violation of the criminal code. But I think most of them are aware that they are harming another person. And it's just convenient not to delve too deeply into that. So that's why I don't think, that prevention work in sexual violence is about educating people about, so these behaviors are wrong. I mean,
they know it. Yeah. Most of it. Yeah. And there one study done that 83% plan it before they go, wow, the college rapists. There's some other survey evidence of that too. Cynthia, well, actually, let's take this question from Jennifer because it ties into the causes of perpetration. Can you tell us more about the connection between narcissism and serial offenders?
Yes, and there is there's not a lot of research, but there's enough research and certainly a lot of from just personal cases that I've worked on. Narcissism is a major component of, if you're looking at personality traits that increase the likelihood of sexual violence, perpetration of sexual violence. In addition to narcissism, not surprisingly, so is psychopathy or sociopathy. And when you get those two together, you get a pretty toxic combination. And what both narcissism and sociopathy or psychopathy do is they just make it more likely that this is a person who just doesn't see another human being. And of course, when you don't see another human being, then there's far less to inhibit you from doing harm to that person. And these are so much more likely to you're much more likely to see that combination of character traits in serial offenders.
Thank you. Cynthia is asking, she says, I'm a philosopher who's written about rape philosophically. I hear that you really see the origins of sexual violence to be largely social, and I agree. Nonetheless, most cultures nowadays seem to have a deeply held belief that this is, quote, what men do, as if sexual violence is an essential quality in humans, as if it is in our genes, or I would assume essential quality in men. What are your reactions to such biological determinism?
Well, I do think that there are biological factors. I think there are biological sources for aggression. Now, aggression, though, can take many, many different paths. I'm not sure I see much evidence that there are strong biological determinants of sexual aggression. But of course, it's not surprising that aggression can go down that path. But going down that path, you have to, if you look at the social context, I mean, just think about the amount of imagery and information and all kinds of stuff that men absorb from very young ages. So if you have somebody who, by virtue of their sex, has I don't know if it's, how to characterize it. They have more aggressive tendencies. That's quite possible that, that there is, that biological difference. But how that aggression gets channeled, I think is quite obviously heavily directed by the culture in which that individual is raised. So, how do you apportion it? There's a reason why, our prisons are full of men and much fewer women. And so I do think there's a biological difference. But it's I don't see biology as destiny. And we socialize ourselves in so many different ways. It's not that difficult to socialize aggression, to channel it. There are many boys and girls who are, as we speak, they are learning ways to channel your aggressive tendencies, to channel when you're hurt, when somebody slights you, when somebody takes something from you on the playground. We teach kids to, use their words. We teach kids to count to 10. So yes, I think males probably do have more tendencies toward aggression, but I don't think it's their destiny.
Yes, absolutely not. And so someone asked about the link between culture, video games like Grand Theft Auto, which has a scene where you get extra points, you get money for having sex with a prostitute and then killing her violently. But a link between media and sexual violence. And it sounds like, we could go through, but it sounds like the answer to that is yes, but we could go through the various ways that shape this, or maybe that's a question for you. Like what are the different ways in which we learn this? We learn how to channel. our aggression?
Well, yeah, I mean, I worry a lot about video games and look, you know, I don't know if it's just the Marine Corps. I think it's probably more than the Marine Corps now. They're using video games in training because, you know, it's the armed forces have learned long ago that, you know, they used to train soldiers to fire to, you know, use their weapons on targets, right? The bullseye. And then they realized that if you want to train a soldier to fire his or her weapon at another human being, it's more effective training to train them with not a bullseye, but a silhouette of a human being. And when video came along in video games, they realized, my God, you know, this is really sort of hyper realistic. We could actually use video games to train soldiers to fire at a moving human being, right, you know, on a screen. And this actually helps to disinhibit them from actually firing their weapon in real life at another human being in a combat situation. Well, now we have kids growing up essentially being trained to fire weapons at other human beings. And, you know, I think this is, it's a horror. It's a horror that's going on. And then we wonder why, you know, 18-year-olds are shooting up schools. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's bad.
And the effects will be felt. We beta tested all of this, right, on young people, and so we see the effects many decades later. We don't have time to get to all of these great questions, but hopefully you will. So send me your email with a question for David, and I'll pass it along. But one last question: how do you stay hopeful, or do you, engaging in this work? Sometimes it feels like we have no chance of eradicating rape culture.
Well, I just think, and this gets easier with age. So I'm going to be 70, you know, next year. And with age, you realize that, you know, it takes time, and time, as I kept using the word generations, and I'm not, you know, being careless with that word. And it's okay. I mean, I know it's not okay, right? We want this to stop. And we'd like to see, you know, really, you know, sort of big change sooner. But you know what? If we don't work on this, nothing will change. And
yeah, what's
you know,
the alternative? To not do the work? Yeah.
Well, exactly. And so, yeah, it's just going to take a long time. It's going to take longer than any of us can, you know, we're going to see in our individual lifetimes. But we are part of a multi-generational effort to make these kinds of changes. And if we keep working and we keep, you know, teaching and training younger people to take our place and keep this sort of fight going, then big changes will be made.
There we go. Well, that is a beautiful end to an incredible conversation, David. I'm going to bring up Frida Kahlo-Cat to for a little therapy. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for your brilliance and your insight and your many decades of activism and research and advocacy around this issue. Hope everybody will read as much as they can of David's work. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Good to see everyone. Frida's just waking up. Take care, y'all. Be kind to yourselves.